Hey peeps, it's 8:30, so it's time for the 8:30 live. Now, I kind of have to get back to work. Oh, YouTube's online. God, YouTube is just not very good at this. But whatever, it's time for the 8:30 live. There's some ridiculous shit that happened in the world today, but I got to get back to work. So we're going to go through it because that's sort of how we do. And then I'm going to have a real hard stop. And, I guess we can do an hour maybe. We'll see how it goes, but it's going to be a real hard stop because I got to get back to work. So here we go. Let's start with the big thing because it's big news, and I think a lot of people are misinterpreting it based on all the sharing I see, and that is the Supreme Court's blocking of the release of grand jury materials to Congress. Grand jury materials from the Mueller report. That's the important part. Sorry. It's 8:38, 8 minutes. I'm sorry, Dorian. It's not my job to do this, although I wish it were. But as a result, I have to do other things, which are just requirements. So yeah, I was a little bit behind schedule. I am here now, though. I did put together a bunch of things to talk about for everybody. And you missed yesterday when we did a whole thing. We did the Magna Carta. It was magnificent. I did a bunch of economic theory and economic history stuff. But you can check it out on the feed on the whatever, I guess, the feed. Speaking of which, let me share this to my page while we do this. But that being said, I got to get cracking because I need to get through this so I can go back to work. Okay, so that being said, let's do it. Mueller report, not released. So grand jury material from the Mueller report has been withheld from Congress for a period by the Supreme Court. Now, here's why that's happening. Basically, Mueller impaneled the grand jury to hear the case on Donald Trump and the Russia investigation. A lot of the information, all of the evidence presented to the grand jury was embargoed, so nobody could access to it, and that is sort of how grand juries normally go. Congress, during the impeachment investigation, subpoenaed the materials from the grand jury so that they could use it in their impeachment and so that Congress could know all of the redacted pieces of the Mueller report. A federal court and a federal court of appeals both agreed that Congress should have access to this material. However, there's, of course, one level of jurisprudence above the Federal Appeals Court, and that is the Supreme Court of the United States. This is a temporary hold on Congress receiving the grand jury materials for the Mueller report because when the Court of Appeals ordered that Congress should receive the material, the administration argued that they should not be able to receive it before the administration has had an opportunity to file its appeal with the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, apparently in a unanimous decision, there doesn't seem to be any dissent, the Supreme Court stayed the order to deliver the Mueller report grand jury information to Congress until June 1st so that briefs could be received. So this isn't some partisan rigmarole undertaken by the court, and I don't really think it's a violation of due process or justice either. It is reasonable that if you are a defendant or a plaintiff in a case and you want to appeal that case, the order given by the court which you're appealing should be stayed until you at least have the opportunity to file for an appeal. So that's what's happening. Unfortunately, the justice system does move slowly. Of course, we'd all like the appeal to be filed tomorrow and for the Supreme Court to decide whether or not to hear the case tomorrow and for that case to then be heard and decided tomorrow, but that's just not how it is. The Supreme Court is obviously hearing many, many other important cases right now, and they will not take up this case at all until their next session, very likely, even if they decide whether or not to hear it this session. So June 1st is when the briefs are due, and then the court will decide whether or not to even take up the case. It is possible that the court will simply uphold the verdict of the lower level, and then the information will be transmitted to Congress per the decision of the Court of Appeals. I think it would actually be the most partisan outcome for the court to agree to hear it, and that could be a split decision because that would delay the transmission of those documents, maybe even until after the election, when there would be a new Congress, and it certainly wouldn't, come out before the November election is due to take place. Okay, so that's the situation with the Supreme Court and Mueller. Now, as I mentioned when I first jumped on, I got to go do some work, so there's going to be a hard stop here. So I'm going to move through some of these items as quickly as I can, and I'll take comments. Let's see if there's any comments that came in. Isn't the Mueller report super old news? Nobody cares about it anymore. It is not super old news. It is somewhat old news. It only feels super old because now the biggest scandal since Watergate is just one of many scandals and many catastrophes and many calamities our country faces. So it feels far away because of this time compression in our minds. But the Mueller report is only 3 years old at this point, really. A little bit less, actually, because the Mueller investigation lasted about a year. So we're 2.5 years away from the Mueller report. And the impeachment hearing was only a few months ago, even though that sounds ridiculous to say. So this is not a stale subject matter, and there's still information out there which could inform Congress as to any wrongdoing by the administration, which was in the redacted part of the report, which, again, they've been trying to get their hands on for some time now. So if this were a different world, we would be right on schedule for, the Supreme Court has to decide whether Congress can receive materials. But instead, in everybody's mind, we're, it's been 10 years since Donald Trump was impeached. No. Okay. Speaking of calamities that the United States is undertaking, 2 dams broke in Michigan. So they're sort of reliving Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, which, as you might recall, was really due not to the storm itself, but to a levee breaking. And a levee which had been failed to be maintained by that government because they were cutting corners on maintenance. Well, that's exactly what's happening in Michigan with these 2 dams. There's flooding all over the place. Hopefully everybody's safe. But the United States has put off investment in infrastructure for so long that the amazing things we built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s are starting to fail. And by 50s, I also mean the 30s and 40s, because a lot of this infrastructure was built during the Great Depression. This might be an opportune time, in fact, to go back and do some New Deal level infrastructure work. But that being said, because of divestment for decades and decades and decades and cutting of taxes for decades and decades and decades, governments have been trying to avoid spending money and putting off this critical infrastructure investing, to the point that the Army Corps of Engineers is giving the United States a D- or, F grade on a lot of infrastructure for many years. Now, Donald Trump, when he was elected, did say that he'd be pumping something like, $1 trillion or $100 billion or something into infrastructure, and had his whole infrastructure week. But that was pretty well derailed by the fact that they would say the Democrats were against his presidency, but it was really derailed by the massive tax cuts that he was pushing. And he couldn't get everything done. And his attempt to undo Obamacare for, 6 months and then push for massive tax breaks for corporations really stymied the momentum that he had to do anything of any value. And we should not be surprised by that, because what of value has this president done except give giant corporations a humongous tax break and make rich people really, really happy, which is not nothing. It's just not something really good. Speaking of which, there was a report in ProPublica that rich people are running away with the shop right now, but we might be on the verge of a second 2008 financial crisis type situation. Now, I don't mean that insofar as the mortgage industry is going to collapse, or do I? I actually mean commercial mortgages. So you might remember that in 2008, it was all about home mortgages. So residential mortgages, where people had inflated, there were subprime loans given to people who shouldn't have had loans in the first place. Well, not only did people get subprime loans, that is to say, folks who were incapable of supporting the value of that loans were given loans because there was this bonanza of debt issuance, and the requirements for taking on debt were lowered. But there were also inflation prices and outright lying on the value of these homes, so that you could issue bigger and bigger mortgages, thereby reaping bigger and bigger payoffs. And then you could chop that up and sell it to banks for repackaging into derivatives. Now, I'm not going to go into how derivatives work. The important thing to understand is that right now we've got a crisis that's killing the commercial real estate industry. But there was this report in ProPublica citing a whistleblower on Wall Street, basically made the case that banks have been lying about the value of commercial properties and about the income streams that those properties are generating. What does this mean? It means that they've been writing mortgages which they know have an inflated value, and that the takers of that debt can't really afford. Now, as long as commercial real estate income keeps going up, and as long as commercial real estate value keeps going up, it doesn't really matter if your debt is inflated, because you're going to meet those expectations as the value of your real estate continues to climb. However, if you go into a crash situation where for some reason nobody's paying their rent anymore and the value of your property declines precipitously, now your mortgage is way more than you can afford, and it's worth more than the property on which you took the mortgage. So that is exactly what led to the subprime mortgage crisis, because when people couldn't pay back, they started to default en masse. And when you had defaults en masse, then you had the crash of real estate values, which made up a lot of people's individual wealth, a cratering of the consumer economy because people felt poorer and in fact were poorer, and the movement of all of these assets to governments and banks, which then had to let them out onto the market, further cratering home prices and devaluing real estate. Now, commercial mortgage collapses and commercial real estate collapses are slightly different because the people on the hook tend not to be individuals. You know, it's not going to be your families that own property that then have their mortgages come due, and the family, these individuals, these consumers are wiped out. That's being taken care of by the pandemic. But the rich people and the landowners who are sort of running away with this thing, with all of the value in the economy, and are seeing the gains, they might experience a serious shock, which we would say is like comeuppance and justice. But in reality, it could have serious impacts for the course of the economy as large real estate holdings lose their value, and for tax receipts to the government, which we've spoken about many times before, because real estate taxes make up so much of government resources and government revenue here in the United States, particularly when you talk about education. So this potential weakness in the commercial real estate market might represent a huge unseen risk in the American economy that is being exacerbated or really precipitated by the fact that coronavirus is forcing people to stay at home, devaluing commercial real estate, and really removing the need for people to have offices for which they pay rent. Okay, now let's see what we got. Deidre Levy had a question. Could you talk about this? Quote, through a federal relief effort, the state was recently approved to disperse the coronavirus pandemic electronic benefit transfer, or P-EBT. The sweeping program will automatically send families the equivalent of about $570 per day to make up for meals that each student would have been eligible for while in school. The answer to your question is, I can't really talk about that tonight because I don't know anything about it, but I'm happy to look into it and do an analysis on that for tomorrow. Let's see, there was one other comment, and then we're going to continue to move through some of the stuff because, again, I actually have to run tonight. Dorian Key, any chance you got to reach out to your second-degree contacts from me in the census contract tracers? Pour moi. I feel like that's an interpersonal thing between you and me, so I'm not going to dive into that here on a public stream. But we'll talk about that offline. Now, so what did we cover? Well, we spoke about the Mueller report today, or we spoke about the stay that the Supreme Court has put on the redacted sections of the Mueller report to Congress. We spoke about the dams breaking in Michigan and the lack of investment in infrastructure the U.S. has experienced over the last, 50 years, more than 50 years now, 60 years. We spoke about the potential collapse of subprime commercial mortgages. That would be bad. Really annoying to think about that because obviously the residential mortgage collapse or crisis was devastating. Let's talk about the census for a second. Or actually, not so much the census, but the Trump administration's attempt to make up for the fact that the Supreme Court decided a question on citizenship could not be included in the census. So, first off, if you haven't filled out the census, fill it out. Like, what are you doing? It's way past time for that. Second, you might remember that there was a huge fight as to whether or not the administration could use the census to ask people their immigration status. Ultimately, it was decided no. Even though the information for the census is not to be used to find immigrants and undocumented people, it was seen that it would be a deterrent. Well, now the Trump administration is working quite hard to figure out who is and who is not an immigrant by compiling other sources of information and rolling that into the census, including documents and information from DHS, Department of Homeland Security, Social Security Administration, Medicare and Medicaid, and also state DMVs that are complying with the requests. So, what is this going to do? Ultimately, it's extremely unlikely this is going to lead to the hunting down of immigrants or undocumented people by the Trump administration. However, I wouldn't put it past them to start using the census that way and then have it taken to court and for them to continue to use it while they're in court and to really just say, we don't really care if we lose the court case because we'll have done what we want up until then. I wouldn't really put that past them. But what I will say is that would technically be illegal. The Census Administration may or may not yield to the president's desire to have that. But ultimately, this isn't even about the hunting down of immigrants. This is about understanding for them where the immigrant pockets are, census tract by census tract, because that is how redistricting is done. And ultimately, the play here is to figure out where immigrant populations are clustered around the country and then draw districts in such a way as to disenfranchise them. Or, and this is another component or another possibility, to have states change their laws so that districts are drawn by the number of eligible voters as opposed to the number of residents. And this is technically possible. There is a legal philosophy of one person, one vote, which means that you cannot disproportionately advantage one district over another. So they all have to be counted up in the same way and have equal representation by district. This is usually done by counting the population of the census and then creating districts which have equal sizes of residents. However, it's not clear that it would be illegal to try and determine who the actual voters are and then draw districts based on one eligible voter, one vote. This would then, the idea here then is to deprioritize or reduce the representation of areas with large immigrant populations who are not voters. Of course, the census is very clear that it's about residents, but in terms of electoral map drawing, the door is certainly open to trying to figure this out. But speaking of, I think the biggest news of the day is that Donald Trump threatened two states, Michigan and Nevada, with withheld federal funds during a pandemic because they are taking steps to enable vote by mail. The president called their actions illegal, which they are not. He lied again and threatened to stop federal funding for programs in those states unless they roll back their attempts to provide mail-in ballots to their voters. Now, in Michigan in particular, this is super ridiculous because Michigan is not doing a vote by mail program. It's doing what New York does, which is provide an absentee ballot request form to voters who then have to fill it in. Now, Donald Trump's argument here is, of course, that there'll be rampant voter fraud and that this will empower immigrants and those Democrats who just vote across county lines and all this other nonsense that's been pretty much disproven in its entirety. But it is absolutely ridiculously mind-boggling that a president would try to interfere in the election procedures of states, processes which are given to them by the Constitution. They have control of these processes, and threaten to withhold federal funding unless he gets his way. That's basically extortion. I really hope that, Donald Trump is going to run into some legal challenges here, and I really hope that the courts are on the side of states and voters on this one. I hope that they're on the side of voters in every case, but it's just not how it is. But in this case in particular, it would set just a ridiculous, incredible precedent to allow a president to withhold federal funding in retaliation for expanding the franchise. Really, they shouldn't be able to hold federal funding in retaliation for anything because Congress controls the allocation of funds and the president is there to execute the will of Congress. But this is just an absolute words escape me for this. It's just such a scary idea that the president could, during the middle of a national crisis, say, I'm going to defund federal programs in your state and prevent you from receiving federal money unless you change your voting process. It's just absolutely beyond the pale. And ironically, if Republicans really want to identify all the voters in the country and start drawing districts around voters and cut out immigrant populations, the number one thing they should do is be pushing automatic voter registration and vote by mail, because then you're going to easily be able to identify everybody who's a voter and everybody who's actually voting, because automatic voter registration would delineate people who can vote from people who can't vote. Now, that's not perfectly lined up with your immigrant communities, but there's a lot of it in there. So why don't they just push automatic voter registration and push vote by mail so they can see where the voters are? Because the whole point of this is that voting is not good for Republicans. They do not come out ahead when more people vote. More people in this country are progressive. More people in this country do not side with Republicans. And if more people in this country voted, they would be swept out of power, which is their own quote. You can go look it up. Donald Trump said as much. He said, if more people voting is bad for Republicans. So it is just absolutely nuts that the president would tweet that and threaten states so brazenly. It's nuts they would threaten states at all, but it happens. It's just so incredibly brazen that he gets on Twitter and is just like, Nevada and Michigan are behaving illegally by allowing people to vote by mail in a pandemic. So I'm looking into withholding all federal funding from them. Whatever. Now I'm just ranting. Like now I'm just so beside myself. Like, it's so incredibly dangerous and ridiculous whatever. I got limited time here tonight, so I'm moving on. Got to move on. Louisville, Breonna Taylor. Are we all familiar with the situation with Breonna Taylor? This is a little bit of good news. So Breonna Taylor was an African-American woman who was sleeping in her bed when police came with a no-knock warrant, busted in. Her boyfriend, who was with her and had a legal firearm and a permit, got up and started shooting at these intruders. Now, the police, again, no-knock warrant, and they were ununiformed, right? They were plain clothes. So he started shooting at these people who basically just kicked in his door and started yelling and pulled out their guns. He shot at them. They shot back. And Breonna Taylor, who was in a room, in the bedroom, not in this living room, which was by the door, in her bedroom, got shot. How did this happen? Because they unloaded something like 25 rounds just as a hail of bullets. And I want you to understand this. Like, bullets go straight when you shoot them. If you bust down a door and there's somebody in a hallway or in a room that comes out and shoots at you, and you start shooting at them, the bullets just don't fly everywhere of their own accord. They found bullets in the living room, they found bullets in the kitchen, and they found 8 bullets in Breonna Taylor in the bedroom, which is where she died. This was literally just spraying bullets everywhere without any regard for safety or even the direction of their assailant, as far as I can tell. Now, this is a travesty. And all of these, well, actually, I don't know what the situation for the officers is right now. But what I can say is that the Louisville Police Department has made 2 commitments to address this problem, both of which I think we really need to wait to see if they're worth anything. The first is no-knock warrants must now go through the police chief and be signed by that person before going to a judge. Now, I don't know. I'm not a cop. If there's any cops here, you tell me. Does it sound like having another police officer sign off on whether or not a no-knock warrant should be issued makes a huge difference in this chain of events? If a judge is going to issue a no-knock warrant, does having the police chief look at it first really provide another level of accountability, or really provide a situation where that could be turned down? I feel like that person would be more likely to approve a no-knock warrant than a judge, meaning that you haven't really limited the number of no-knock warrants. But I could be wrong. So whatever, another layer of review is, of course, welcome. The other thing that they're going to undertake is a body cam policy. So now all officers will be wearing body cameras, which is great. Or is it? The biggest problem with body cameras is when you turn them on and what they can see, and whether or not the footage is ever made public or accessible to civilians. So body cams are a cool idea, but they rely entirely on the policies on how those body cams are used. So is it welcome that the Louisville Police Department will now be outfitting its police with body cams so that there'll be a record of what happens? I would say yes. But is that useful if nobody can ever see it? Civilians can't request it, and the body cams don't have to be turned on, or they only get turned on when police remember to do so? No. Like, that's useless. And we've run into these problems many times with body cams. And so the devil is always in the details with things like this. So we can only wait and see what the results are. But I personally don't think that this goes nearly far enough, at least certainly in what we've been promised. And the last thing I wanted to mention tonight is just a fun little fact. Michael Cohen, you might remember him as the guy who really ratted out on Trump. And it's just so interesting now that Michael Flynn, DOJ has moved to dismiss Michael Flynn's case, to just think and remember all the people who were arrested in connection with Donald Trump, and that doesn't even seem to be weighing on people's minds. I mean, it's sort of like in the back of your mind somewhere maybe, but maybe it should be towards the front. When you talk about Donald Trump and his lying and the coronavirus, just remember, pretty much all of his close associates were arrested, and a lot of them went to jail. So, Michael Cohen, he's being released. He's being released to serve out the rest of it at home because of the pandemic. And, you know, I'd say that's criminal justice reform, except that it's the same old of privileged people and wealthy people getting off easy while everybody else is stuck in their cells while COVID-19 rages through prisons all across the country. In any event, that's sort of it for the evening because I gotta go. You know, I'll see if there's any comments to do, but we'll get back to the Magna Carta tomorrow, and we'll get back to the wonderful discussions we have on economic history and economic theory and Enlightenment philosophy that come out of the Magna Carta, because people seem to like that, and it's of course super fascinating for me to go through these primary sources and see how they impacted the founding of our own country and the documents that define our lives. But not tonight, folks. Sorry about that. I will scroll through real quick and see if there's any comments that I missed. And then, nope, I don't think so. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Oh, yeah, and Deidre, if you could send me that in the chat so I can look into it for tomorrow's, we will talk about pandemic electronic benefit transfers for, I don't even know what that's about, but I will look into it, and then I will give you a good holistic rundown tomorrow. All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. It's always wonderful to see you all. I'll see you tomorrow at 8:30. Why did that? Yeah. There you go.